All right. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself? We're really excited. I know we're really excited to have this interview on LRT Sports, and you and I have talked a little bit, but why don't you give us a little background about yourself?
Thanks, Kirsten. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. My name's Arthur Smith. I'm a college admissions consultant. My firm, Arthur Smith Advising, I work with high school students and their families as they go through that complicated process of applying to colleges and doing their applications. A number of my students are athletes and competitive athletes, and they want to continue their athletic journey in college. And so I work very closely with them in navigating the recruiting process, whether that's identifying programs or contacting coaches, understanding the rules, the timeline, the whole 9 yards with that. And I've really enjoyed that. My firm is working with a number of families right now, ninth graders all the way through 12th graders. Some are athletes, some are not, but the ones who are athletes really bring a fun part to this whole journey for me, particularly because my own personal journey through higher education has involved both athletics and just, general thinking about admissions in colleges. And I guess what I mean by that is that for 23 years, I was a Division I cross country and track coach. For 3 years, I coached cross country and track at Duke when I was working and finishing my doctorate in history there. And then for 20 years, I was a women's cross country and track coach at my undergraduate alma mater, Cornell University. I began there as an assistant women's cross country and track coach, like I said, and became the head women's cross country coach, then the head women's track coach. So that was a really great opportunity for 20 years to coach young people at my alma mater. But what made it extra fun, and I think helps me in my current role, is that I had opportunities to work on the academic side of the university while I was also coaching. So kind of a unique journey for me, because I was also an advising dean and an admissions dean in our liberal arts college while I was also coaching. So I like to say that in the afternoons, I was working with students on the track, and in the mornings, I got to work with them through their academic goals and a lot of the same kinds of issues and problems that we would try to work with, just in different settings. But in that role, I chaired admissions committees. And then for 4 years in there, I also was the liaison between the athletic department and the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at Cornell. So I was helping the athletic department, the head coaches for the 36 teams at the time, meet their recruiting needs through the admissions process, and then also helping make the admissions people feel comfortable that these students that were being advanced by the coaches met the standards that Cornell and the Ivy League expected, that these students had the capability and the background to be successful at Cornell. So my combination of working with students in admissions, advising, but then coaching has been really valuable for me in helping students now. And one thing that's been really great about working with students, these high school students and their families, is building these connections with families to help figure out how I can help them get down the path to achieve their goals. That was always the most rewarding thing as a coach, was listening to students, trying to understand where they wanted to go in their running career, and then hopefully providing a path to get them there. And it's the same sort of thing in working with high school students at this stage. And I'm hoping that now that I've stepped out of the rigors of being a coach, that I can give back to a lot of these families by helping them on their path to finding a successful college career.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And such great experience as well. So anybody listening, you might want to take the time to listen to this full interview because, you just have such a great, well-rounded background on both things. So
Thanks.
let's get into some questions.
Sure.
So right now during COVID, how has admissions changed, like the process or anything? Has it changed? Has it not? And if so, how has it changed?
Yeah, so there's certainly still a lot of unanswered questions. It's a wonderful question. In every family that I talk to, that's the first thing on their mind. What's different? What's evolving? And a lot of the answers to that we're going to find out actually in the next few weeks, as the first round of admissions decisions are already beginning to come out from various selective schools that offer early decision or early action. And as we see what happens with application numbers to universities around the country in the next few weeks and months. But I think what is clear is that the metrics that many universities have relied on in the past are going to be very different, that students haven't had the same opportunities that they've had in past years to be involved in extracurricular activities, that the very nature of the classes they've been taking are different. SATs and ACTs are not available in the same way, and so many schools and universities are no longer requiring that those scores be used in their evaluation process. So this is creating an uncertain landscape for the people that do admissions, and it's going to be really interesting. It's going to depend a lot on the schools, how much they quote unquote bend in terms of focusing more on the personal side of an application, the story that a student presents, how they're going to interpret grades that now classes have been taken online. How will they be able to really understand the kinds of activities that students have been involved in? There really is a lot of uncertainty. And then you add to that students are hedging their bets for good reason. Many are applying to so many more schools than they have in the past to cover their bases. And so one of the jobs of an admissions officer is not just to admit qualified students, but each school has complicated formulas and algorithms to admit the right number of students because they want to yield a certain percentage of those. And the yield numbers are going to look a lot different at schools, because will students be willing to go far away from home with all of this uncertainty next year? We're all hoping that things will look a lot different next year, but we don't know that. And so how will that affect the choices that students and their families make? So, the long answer is there's a lot of complicated factors at work. The short answer is we're going to see. But what I've been advising students to do is to focus on what they can control. This is good advice from a coach to an athlete, but it's applicable to all students right now in the application process. You can't control this pandemic, but you can control the kind of narrative you want to put forth in your college application, and you can control the great effort that you put into your classroom work right now. And those ultimately are the most important things in your application.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of touched on this a little bit in your answer, but with testing not necessarily being mandatory, not as accessible, you see sometimes I believe College Board ruled that now they're doing a county by county decision or state by state. I'm not sure exactly. So since testing may or may not be applicable at this particular moment, and there's more focus on GPAs and extracurriculars, and admissions officers are obviously taking a deeper look, probably in a very different way than they ever have before. What can student athletes kind of do in order to separate their application from the rest of the crowd at this point? What are some tips that you have for them on that?
That's a great question. And the first thing I would want to reassure student athletes is that they already have something great going for them. And that's their commitment to the team that they've been involved in presumably multiple years of involvement, especially if they're a student athlete that wants to continue doing that at the college level, a level of achievement and leadership that probably stands out from the crowd. So student athletes should feel very good that they've got a ready-made activity that speaks to a lot of values that college admissions officers care about. So that's the first thing. But the second thing to really focus on in making sure that they stand out is thinking about what is it that drives me to be in my sport or other activities that may make up their resume. And I always want to make sure that the students that are applying to college have a coherent narrative, if that makes sense, a consistent theme about what motivates and connects the different activities and things that student cares about in their career. It's not particularly helpful for an admissions officer to see a student who's got 15, 12 different activities that are unrelated. It's okay to be somewhat unrelated, but to have a one-off activity and then you go and to the other end of the spectrum at the high school and do something else for 1 month and then go find something different, that back and forth lack of coherency doesn't really speak to one's level of commitment or a real passion for something. And so again, student athletes, that's not a problem. If they've been committed to their sport, that's a real strength in an application. And being able to emphasize that and think about, why did I play lacrosse? Why am I running track? And thinking about those things that motivate you. Okay, is this also motivating me in other areas of my life? So that when you put together your college applications, those themes start to come through. And so that coherence and that really questioning yourself, looking in the mirror and asking yourself, what is it that makes me get out the door to do these activities, and articulating them in a clear way, those are the two main pieces of advice I would give to make sure that you get a chance to stand out.
Awesome. Great, great response. And then in general, do you feel like it's going to be more difficult for student athletes during COVID? Doesn't necessarily just have to be from an admissions perspective, maybe from a just general athletic perspective. And what are your thoughts on just the difficulties right now?
Yeah, so I think the good news for student athletes is that at the majority of our universities around the country, there are still athletic teams. There's been some really heartbreaking news in the past 6 months with universities that have cut athletic programs. That's been really hard to watch. But the vast majority of sports and programs are still open for business. So this means that coaches are still recruiting. They still want people to come out for their team because they've got to look ahead to the future. Coaches in college are not just thinking about next week. They're not just thinking about next year. They're thinking 2 and 4 years down the road. So there are still those opportunities are still there. I think the challenge for athletes right now, student athletes right now, is the uncertainty that's inherent in college athletics related to roster spots, playing time. Let's even get past the assumption that when will we start playing again? It's going to start back up again. But when it does, each program is going to be different in terms of, will people that were scheduled to have graduate this May or even last May, will they be coming back because the NCAA has done the right thing and granted extra windows of time for them to complete their eligibility? So how will that impact an incoming freshman next year in terms of playing time or roster spot availability? Again, I'm confident that coaches will continue to recruit, but a question that I would encourage students to be asking the coaches that they're in touch with is, how will I fit in? What's your roster looking like? This may then trickle down to impact scholarship availability because depending on the resources that a particular athletic department has, they may be honoring the athletic scholarships of previous students that are able to continue on due to COVID where they wouldn't have continued on in the past. But does that mean now there's less scholarships available? And so these are questions that students should not be afraid to be asking, but they're kind of additional hurdles that folks are going to have to navigate and get over. But I do think athletes should be encouraged that if they're being recruited, that means that sport's open for business at that school. They may be missing out on an important season right now, or maybe different than it was in the past, but they should be hopeful that that's going to be there in the future. The challenge now will be to find the right place that gives them the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And there's this big misconception in general with athletics that athletes have a specific application process that's different, and maybe they're more lenient or whatever. And that's obviously a very big misconception. So do you want to kind of talk about what the application process looks like for athletes?
Yeah, so I think that you nailed it on the head. There's a real common misconception out there that if I'm a recruited athlete, I've got a different application I got to do, or maybe I don't even have to do it, or my coach is going to do it for me. And no, I mean, student athletes need to be prepared to, work on the common application or the coalition application. Majority of the schools in our country use those basic application systems. You're still going to have to apply. You still have to go through the same door that the rest of the student body goes in. The NCAA is not interested in, despite what it seems sometimes with the revenue streams and all that, creating a completely different institution only for athletes. We still want our student athletes to have the overall student experience that makes college so special. So you're going to have to go through that same door. That said, especially if someone's being recruited, being able to take advantage of the coaches network and resources at the university to get ahead of the process is often an advantage that athletes have. So you still got to prepare to do the application, but almost every school has some sort of system in place where the coach gets access to information on your decision before you do, can track the status and where your application is moving through the process in a way that maybe a non-recruited or a non-athlete wouldn't be able to get during that process. And that can be invaluable, particularly if the coach has been there for a long time. They're going to have great insight into, if there are multiple admissions offices at an institution, which one's more likely to open for you given your particular background. So while student athletes still need to go through the same paperwork process, get their test scores in if those are required, submit the common application, definitely they have additional resources that can make a big difference. And it'd be a big mistake not to ask coaches for that kind of advice and get pointed in the right direction to get that kind of help.
Yeah, awesome. And, kind of diving into that a little bit more, do you want to talk about how the application process is different for Ivy League? And I'll even group in NESCAC, Liberty League, like high academic institutions. Maybe it's not the common app. Like, what are the differences that you see?
Yeah, so certainly, athletics can play a significant role in Ivy League admissions and selective school admissions. I don't think, I mean, that's a fact. And being recruited by a coach, if they support you and formally offer that support to admissions, that can give someone a real leg up. But the bottom line is, student athletes who are being supported in that process in the Ivy League and similar schools are only going to gain admission if the admissions offices feel like that student can actually do the work. And students should feel good about that. I mean, you don't want to be admitted to a school that you're already going to be way behind the curve and struggle in the classroom. You're not going to have a good athletic experience if you're struggling in the classroom. So that guardrail, if you will, that admissions offices are not going to go below a certain line to admit someone, students should feel good about, so that they know if they're admitted, yep, they're getting help from a coach, but on every level that matters, they're capable of at least being successful, even if not all of their testing metrics or GPAs exactly match up with what they read about online that is the quote unquote average at those schools. The Ivy League is committed to only admitting athletes that can do the work. Any student that they admit, they feel like they can do the work. But the process, it's a little different with athletes. They're speaking of the Ivy League, coaches have the ability to take application materials before a student applies and share it with colleagues within the admissions office to get some advance feedback. This does not replace the actual application using the common application or the specific application that school provides, but it's invaluable because of the 50,000 students that may apply to individual Ivy League schools each year. 49,000 are not getting, 49,500 are not getting that kind of green light ahead of time. That really is a great opportunity. So when students get recruited by an Ivy League coach and that coach wants their transcripts and test scores and senior year schedule, wants to get a sense of what their academic interests are, they should take that as a great signal that that's being used to kind of get some potential pre-clearance to move forward with the application process. And then when a student applies, though, the coach does not make that admissions decision. That is solely in the hands of the admissions office. And I think another misconception is, okay, well, the coach got me in, the coach is going to tell me, he's committing to me, so I'm definitely in. Well, the Ivy League actually has pretty specific rules that the coach, under no circumstances, can communicate an official decision. They can't promise that you will be admitted. They can use what's called probabilistic language based on feedback that's garnered ahead of time, and that what I kind of described earlier is a pre-read process. And you would hope that if a coach makes the verbal commitment that I am going to support you, and I've gone through the steps to kind of pre-clear you, you would hope that that coach will stand by that. And when they do stand by that and they support you, the percentage chances of a student getting in are incredibly high at that point. But they've gone through several steps of vetting to get to that stage. Now, you do hear horror stories all the time,
Right.
to kind of back out on that verbal offer. And I coached in the Ivy League for 20 years. Coaches that did that didn't stay very long. And I think a student should feel comfortable if they've seen a coach that's been at that institution in the Ivy League or a selective school for a number of years, or worked in the league for a number of years before they got to that school, that they wouldn't have gotten there if they were constantly breaking those promises, because that's a huge headache for admissions. If they're hearing from a family, well, I was promised this, and they're saying, well, we don't even know who you are. The coach hasn't told us who you are. That's a big headache for the whole university. And it goes against all the kind of the ethical, moral guidelines that these schools like to think that they stand for. But it's important for families to remember that the coaches themselves don't make the admissions decisions in the Ivy League. They can't communicate. It's the admissions office that does that sort of thing. So while it's, I think once you get to build that relationship, it's fair to have trust in that coach. It's not done until you get the actual letter from the admissions office, and it certainly adds a lot of stress to families. So the sooner they can get to build a good, strong relationship with that coach who may be guiding them through that process, I think the less stressful it is and the less likely that it ends in some disappointment.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And you, of course, hear horror stories. You hear things that happen all the time. But to your point, hopefully those coaches aren't in that role for too long of a time, or maybe it's a one-off situation, because there's also the other aspect of athletes assuming, or just students in general assuming, oh, I got into the college, I got the acceptance letter. That doesn't mean that you can go fail a class or get kicked out or anything. So there's that other side of things too, where, maybe the coach is using that language and positive, and then the athlete actually does something to break that tie as well.
Totally. I mean, it is a two-way street. And I should have mentioned that, not coaches aren't the bad guys all the time. There are plenty of reasons why a coach might be forced to back away from their commitment, for the same reason that the admissions office might change their mind on why a few months before they kind of gave the green light or the thumbs up and said, this looks like the kind of candidate that we would feel favorably toward, because as you said, maybe the student had a steep nosedive with their grades. Maybe they ran into disciplinary problems or even legal issues.
Social media too.
So, the coaches in these cases, I think, much in exactly the same way that an admissions office reserves the right to reconsider, that's appropriate. What's frustrating, and I didn't see this happen very often, but we hear the horror stories of when the student's done everything right and been very forthright and thought they had this firm verbal commitment from a coach. And it's one of the reasons, again, why the Ivy League makes a big deal over this really important concept that the coaches themselves do not communicate the final decision. But yes, coaches do advocate. They have a certain number of spots that they might be able to use. And so an athlete, a student, and their family is putting a lot of trust when that coach says, yes, I'm going to use one of these spots on you. And then that student may not apply anywhere else. And they're really counting on that coach coming through. Again, building a relationship ahead of time, communicating, being very clear on what's involved. That's how you avoid these heartbreaks that sometimes you hear about.
Right. Totally understood on that one. And it's Ivy Leagues, but I want to also know it's also D3 schools. And again, those top selective institutions, academic institutions, they kind of all wrap in together. But Ivy League is particularly similar to them because there are no athletic scholarships, which I kind of want to ask you about now. But for Ivy Leagues being a Division I, they're a Division I league. They participate against Division I schools, but they don't have athletic scholarships, which kind of is more on the Division III side, obviously. How could a student athlete receive monetary assistance in lieu of, this situation? And the second part to that question, I'll let you answer this, but the second part is, when should they start that process?
Yeah. So start with the second part because it's a straightforward one. It's never too early to start investigating the financial path in front of you in terms of paying for your child's education, and the student themselves to be aware of the realities that go into that. And there's a lot of ways to research that. Every university now has a financial aid calculator if they offer need-based financial aid on their websites. That's a great place to start. 45-minute stop, plug in the numbers, you can start to get a sense, those sorts of things. But for recruited student athletes, Ivy League and Division III schools that are highly selective that offer need-based aid, again, there's not going to be merit-based aid. The Ivy League is very clear on that. They don't give scholarships in the sense of scholarships being based on, oh, you've got a 4.0 GPA, we'll give an academic scholarship, or, as you've already mentioned, I'm a star hockey goalie, and so I'm going to get a scholarship to a Big Ten school, where you're not going to get a scholarship to play hockey in the Ivy League. Every student really and truly is evaluated based on their family's need. And student athletes, just like they get a little bit of a head start in the admissions process if they're being recruited, where some of their materials before the application is due will be reviewed to give in a kind of a general sense of where it's headed by the admissions office. Coaches, beginning usually in late junior year, can do the same thing with financial aid for student athletes. This is a huge leg up. It's not that these student athletes get a better package. That really is a big misconception in the Ivy League. I can't tell you how many times in 20 years of coaching, I would go through this with families and they'd say, okay, but really, what does the star runner get? Nope, it really doesn't work that way. It is the financial aid process, although the coach can accelerate it and get it done earlier, is evaluated completely separate from the coach with no input from the coach. And but again, most families, everybody else who applies, I'm not going to say most, everybody else who applies, you find out that you got in, and then a few days later, you get your financial aid package. That's the first time at an Ivy League school or one of any of these selective schools that you're talking about that you're going to get your need-based package. But an athlete, if they're being recruited and they ask the right questions, and if the coach is doing their job in a smart way, they're going to help them navigate a financial aid pre-read, in some cases as early as junior year. And that involves getting all the financial aid paperwork in, and then based on that year's financial documents from the family, financial aid office will give an estimate of what it's likely to be. Now, these things can change. You win the lottery, your income goes up, goes down. Right now, I think financial aid offices are dealing with this quite a bit because of the pandemic. Family income changes and financial stresses are often adding to the financial aid obligations the universities provide. But again, getting this information ahead of time is great. And what do the Ivy League and selective schools usually look for in determining need-based aid? They're looking at family income. They're looking at family obligations, meaning debt or supporting other family members. And they're looking at family resources, property that you own, stocks, savings, those sorts of things. And then the formulas go from there to determine what you can afford and then what the university does to meet the rest of that need. And that's the great thing about the Ivy League is that, and so many other schools that offer these wonderful need-based financial aid packages, is that a student can go continue to play athletics for the reasons that they did in high school, and the need is being met separately than for their athletic skills. But obviously at other places in Division I that are extraordinarily successful in athletics, being able to say, hey, you have an athletic talent, let me provide this merit scholarship so you can get this great opportunity at our wonderful school and play for our team. I mean, those are wonderful things as well, but there's two slightly different categories, obviously, for
Yeah.
you to consider.
So off of this, what are two questions? What are the top two questions that a student athlete or a parent of a student athlete be asking the coach during this process in regards to financial aid?
So the first question should be, when can we get started? So when can you get me in touch with a financial aid officer? What are the protocols at your particular school? Because they're going to vary a little bit from school to school. You know, what kind of paperwork can I give you now, and when can we get an answer to that? The second is, if my financial circumstances change between what I'm learning now and when I arrive at your institution, what can be done to give us a guesstimate on what we would have to handle? Because right now, I think there's so much uncertainty with so many folks because of this crazy year that we've been in, and so many people's finances it's hard to predict. And you know, same is true for the universities, but it is a very fair question to ask, what's the process in place? Okay, we've got this pre-read in front of us now, but what if things change for our family in the next year? What will you do to meet our need? And you know, that's where I think a lot of universities are having financial difficulties right now, and they're making painful cuts because they're aware that they have a greater obligation now with financial aid, and they're budgeting for that and planning on financial hits across their institutions because of that. But families should ask, how will you help me if the unforeseen happens? But the first question is the most important one. When can we get started on getting these answers? Anyone looking at highly selective schools who wants to be a student athlete should be asking the coach in the very first conversation, how will you help me know if I can be admitted? And when can we get started on helping me understand how much this is going to cost my family? And students should not feel bad at all asking that in the very first conversation. And a good and experienced coach will be prepared and eager to help them figure those things out right away.
Awesome. So my next question is, I know you've already explained this, but in a, I guess, like short, concise way, what is the coach's role in the admissions process when recruiting an athlete? And I know like you've touched on it, but just so people are clear, what is their role? Because to your point, they're not the decision makers, but what do you see their role as being?
They're the conduit. They're the liaison between the student and the university admissions office. They can help make sure that everything's being processed as efficiently as possible. At some institutions, they may ensure that an application is reviewed well before anybody else. Depends on the institution and that league's rules on these sorts of things. And again, every institution is a little bit differently, but they're the conduit. They're going to move everything through and make sure, hopefully, if they're in touch with you, that you're not missing any kind of key steps along the way. They're not going to complete your application for you, or they better not be, and they're certainly not going to be the one making the final decision. But they're your point person. And then along those lines, to wrap up the answer, they should be able to provide you a lot of great information and insight into the particular programs and the ones that you are going to have a better chance of gaining admission to at their particular school.
Right. And what are some red flags that athletes and parents should be looking out for in regards to coaches during this process? There is a lot of unspoken nuances within this field of recruiting and everything. And sometimes, they can't say things, they can say things. So what are some just general red flags that athletes and parents should be looking for in coaches during this process?
Well, I've always been leery of coaches that overpromise very early. So, it's not that you don't want to trust them if they say, I can do this for you, but you want to beware of an overly stated promise that it's July 5th. Hey, if you give me your application tomorrow, you'll be in next week, or I can promise you that you'll get in 5 months from now. That'd actually be the one I'd be worried about. Well, there's a lot of water that's going to go under the bridge between July and August, and it's rare that an admissions process works quite that fluidly. So a coach that gives a more nuanced answer is that we really want you. Your profile makes it very clear that you're going to be able to get in. I'm not worried about it. Here are the steps. That's an answer that I think a family should be looking for, and not settle for the overpromise without any details, I guess, is what I'm getting at in terms of a red flag. And then the other red flag, and is true in all kinds of recruiting, any stage of the recruiting process, has to do with communication. And if you're infrequently hearing back from a coach, if you're getting mixed signals on where you stand, I would be making sure you have other options. Or give the coach the benefit of the doubt and seek clarity on the mixed signals that they're sending, because they are busy people, and so just because they take a week to reply doesn't mean they're not interested. But if you're going several weeks between replies, if you're always needing 3 emails to get an answer to one question, that would be a concern. I have found in my years that coaches are not good actors. Some people claim that they are, but you get to know them over many months. And what I mean by not being good actors is if they're treating you and acting one way with you over several months, that's how they're going to be when you get there. They don't just act one way in recruiting and then you show up and they're a fundamentally different person. So if you're dealing with a coach who's very frustrating to get a hold of in the recruiting process, but you do get the sense that they want you on their team, what are the chances that they're going to be much more responsive and communicative when you get there? Not very likely. Now, maybe that's not a personality trait of a coach that matters to everybody. They don't necessarily need somebody to reply quickly. But again, you get someone who's consistently over-promising, that's probably how they're going to act when you get there as well. Whereas someone who tends to be organized and thoughtful in their responsive, they're going to continue to be responsive. That you can count on that, because again, people aren't actors in one aspect of their job and then act completely different in the other aspect of their job.
Yeah, totally with you on that one. And then I just want to note quickly, you already mentioned this, but again, sometimes it's great to reiterate to people. Now, Ivy League coaches are not required to stand by verbal offers, correct? Okay. Yeah, you heard it here.
They're not.
We get that question a lot. We really do. And I just want people to know a verbal offer is not your national letter of intent. It's not contractually binding. It is just a verbal offer.
And to be fair to some of those IB coaches, some of the reason that they're not required to is that they may, in their experience, take a quick look at a transcript and say, "Oh, the student's great," and they've seen them play, and they really want that person on their team, and they say, "Hey, we're gonna go to bat for you." And then they go to bat for you, but it turns out when the experts in the admissions office look at it more carefully, there's some red flags that the coach didn't know about. Well, they've supported you, but now all of a sudden that verbal offer doesn't mean anything because, again, the coach is not the one making the admissions decision. So, but yeah, it does, even if they do offer that verbal support, even if they do go through all the processes at their particular institution to vet the student academically and everything's looking like roses, coming up great. And then you hear these stories of coaches that back out of that offer, and that's unfortunate. And again, I don't think you see a lot of those folks stay in the league very often. That it's hard to have credibility going forward when you would do that, unless, as we mentioned earlier, there was some red flag that all of a sudden appeared in the student's profile.
Which does happen. It happens both ways, and that's, to your point, it's a two-way street and everybody has to be prepared to do that. And like, just as you mentioned, a coach might not be super responsive. And if you're not super responsive to the coach, they're going to see that as well. So that's where, you got to treat it like, a good relationship. So I guess next, and you talked about people applying more for colleges or just a larger number during COVID. During non-COVID times, what would your average number of schools that people should be applying to be? Like, what's the target goal? And then during COVID times, what do you think a target goal is for that?
Yeah.
And I know every person's different, and this is why you have your business and everything, but I would say maybe just a ballpark number.
Right. No, absolutely. I would have said before the pandemic, the absolute maximum would be 8 to 10 schools to apply to as a maximum. And so many students would be fine doing, half of that. But as a maximum, because you only have so many hours in a day, and even though there's so much overlap with applications because of the common application and similar questions from school to school, you want to also present a good application. There's only so many hours in the day so you got to cap it at some point. I've always said 8 to 10. This year, the calculus is a little bit different because we just, none of us really know what the acceptance rates are going to be like. They may go down simply because more students apply, but it's the same number of kids that get in. And so students should be responsibly trying to cover their bases a little bit more. So I've upped it with my students to 10 to 12. But again, the same rule of thumb applies. Just because you became a high school senior, they didn't give you more than 24 hours in your day. They haven't given students that much more time to apply. And it doesn't make sense to apply to 15 schools and have those applications be mediocre. You're much better off having a slightly smaller number and having those applications be very strong. And since you have a finite amount of time, you have to prioritize the ones that are the most important. Then what becomes important is very carefully vetting and being honest with yourself. What are my chances at these 10 to 12 schools? And having a good formula and ratio of schools that you feel very, very confident that unless there's some weird mix-up, you're going to get in to cover your bases, and then have a mixture of reaches and higher level reaches that you're doing as well. Now, what I always hope for my students is that they've done the research and they get to the early part of fall of their senior year, whether they're an athlete who's been recruited or someone just going through the normal process, and they've fallen in love with a place, and they can commit or go early decision or early action to a school in the fall and be getting their decision this week in most cases and be done with the process. So in that case, it would actually only apply to one or maybe a few early actions type schools. But those students, we're still working on the rest of their applications, preparing for the worst and hoping that the best happens and they actually get in. So a long answer, but I've upped it to 10 to 12 for most of my students, but I don't advise doing more than that because you only have so many hours in your day, and a mediocre application might as well not do it.
Right. 100%. I got lucky because I actually only applied to one school. I applied early decision to Skidmore. So I knew early on in the process, which was a lot less stressful for me.
Enjoy your senior year. You got to enjoy your senior year.
Yeah.
Waiting until April. Absolutely. And again, since we, so much of your audience are, of course, are student athletes, they've got a huge leg up in this process because they do potentially have the ear of a coach, and the coach can connect them with the student athletes on their team. The opportunity to learn so much about a school is so much higher as a student athlete, and you can have all the information you need to make that commitment in the fall. And that really
Right.
makes your life so much easier senior year and enhances your chances of getting into the school of your dreams.
Awesome. And then my last question for you, and then we'll kind of go back to you a little bit. But obviously, you're an admissions expert. You've been in, athletics, the admissions, academics, all parts of the college application process. And it's also on the other end very stressful for parents right now.
Mhm.
So, what is your advice to parents to be able to make this process less stressful for their kids? Because a lot of times what I see in particular is parents putting a lot of pressure on students, and there being this not great relationship sometimes during this process. So what can parents really do to help their student athletes be less stressed, feel more comfortable, and kind of know that there's not too much that they could do besides have a knockout application?
Yeah. So, I was really lucky in my 20 plus years working as a coach. The parents that I work with were so supportive of their kids and really wanted to see them be the best that they could be. I think the parents that probably were the most effective in helping their students do those sorts of things, and I see this now working with high school age students, are the parents that really make an effort at really communicating with their kids. And by communication, it's not just passing on information. Communication, like a lot of things we talked about today, is a two-way street. It also means listening. And so the most effective parents, listen to what their students are trying to say and have a real conversation about the goals and the challenges that are going to be in front of them. And then that communication continues through whether it's a recruiting process or getting their son or daughter settled at a university, in terms of finding who the resources and the allies are going to be to, one, help their son or daughter get into that school, and two, to be successful. And it's not so much that they're trying to pave the road in front of their kids. That's not useful. I really don't think students, as they head off into college, are now leaving the protected environment of the home, going off into that big bad world. It's the first step with college. And they need to have the freedom to make some mistakes and learn from those mistakes and take some risks and try new paths. But a parent who is really invested in their student success is going to find the resources and the people at that school, the guardrails, if you will, on this road, who will make sure that when a student maybe has a setback or a disappointment, they don't fall off the road and go into a ditch, that there's somebody there that gets that guardrail, pushes them back out onto the road, helps them learn from whatever mistake they made or whatever setback they had to push them down that path. But the parents who set that road up for their kids don't allow their students to have those inevitable setbacks and disappointments, which as an educator, we know is so important to actually greater success down the road. And up through high school, the parents have been the primary guardrails for their kids. One of the hardest things in going off to college is trusting a new set of people that you don't know as well to be that guardrail, and resist the temptation to go kind of be that guardrail or create a safer road for their kids. And that's where student athletes, if they can start a recruiting process early and get to know a coach, and the parent can really communicate with that coach and make that coach start to care about that kid as much as the parents do, they've got an effective guardrail there to make their students' experience be so much more happy, successful, and fruitful. But you can't get that guardrail without communicating. And you can't get to the point of communicating with the coaches and what you want your child to achieve without first communicating with your son or daughter and really listening to what they want, even as you pass on your expertise and things that you care about for them.
Right. Totally makes sense. So thank you for going through all these questions. I know our users are particularly going to love this interview because it was just so informational and so fantastic. So again, I just want to thank you. But if you want, can you just let us know if somebody wants to contact you right now, what's the best way, what's the best email, social media, whatever it is, but how would somebody be able to contact you?
Great. No, happy to. So my firm, Arthur Smith Advising, Our website is, I think, pretty straightforward, arthursmithadvising.com. And when you go to that page, there's all kinds of links everywhere to contact me directly. There are links to get straight to my calendar. Anyone who's interested in working with me, we offer complimentary consultation sessions. In some cases, I've had 3 or 4 complimentary information sessions, consultation sessions with families, one to talk to one parent, one to talk to another parent, and another one with the student themselves. I want to make sure before someone signs up for my services that everybody who's involved, because it's a team effort, is comfortable working with me. And that includes the student. In fact, that's the most important person that should feel comfortable working with me. My phone number, people can reach me anytime, 607-227-0478. My email is on my website. It's acs1@arthursmithadvising.com. But again, just going to my website makes it very easy. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram with those same tags, Arthur Smith Advising. But again, going to my website, there's links to reach me right away. And I really want to emphasize to folks that I'm happy to have as many consultations as they need to get a sense of what my services are, and also so I can learn what that family needs. And not all of my packages and services are the same. We craft them based on what each family needs. Some of my students that are applying to colleges have never picked up a tennis racket or a baseball bat or any kind of sports equipment in their life. And I'm simply helping them with the complex process of applying to colleges and finding the right group of schools to apply to. But a number of my clients, and I really enjoy this, of course, given my background, are looking at great schools and want to find a great academic experience, but sports is really an important part of that journey. And it's been a lot of fun to connect them with coaches and get them started on all of that.
Awesome. Yeah. And I know we'll link everything in the description and the write-up below. So there will be information about your email and links and everything else. We'll link it all up for you so people can contact you easily. But again, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time. And any final piece of advice for anybody out there?
The main thing is as a coach, I always used to say, try to focus on the things you can control. We're living in a crazy time, and it can be really stressful. But if students can just focus on the things they can control, they're going to end up doing great. And then really what I would tell everybody is keep communicating. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Say what you're struggling with, but also articulate what you're excited about doing in the future. And me and my company, we're here to help families, but students should be talking to their parents, talking to their high school coaches, help them get through the process in front of them.
Awesome. Thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.